This is Comics in the Classroom. We are all educators and in one way or another connected to the comics or art industry, and we wanted to talk about all of the ways we can include education and comics together. As a teacher, I've been a teacher for 12 years, and I will talk about me in a minute. I want to start off with Dan. Dan Rucker, also known as the Comic Book Dad. He's been teaching for 20 years, 24 years. Specify. He has his family and he are all involved in reading heavily and also creating. Yeah, and he also likes advising people because he is often connected with the Austin Books and Comics, one of the biggest bookstores in Texas, right? And actually, I'd like to pass it off to you, Dan. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Excellent. Yeah, so I'm in year 24 of a career teaching public high school English classrooms, English language arts. And I also have been doing outreach into public libraries and many cons at high schools as a way to spread literacy and love of reading among young students and among their parents and their teachers, and provide resources for those teachers to spread that back into the classroom. And then I also do work at Austin Books during the weekend, which supplements my own comic book habit.
And we have his information up here on the top with his website, which is thecomicbookdad.com, and also Twitter. Next, we have Mian Rosales. She is an artist and a business owner here in Austin, and also has worked a lot with students K through 12, right? If I understand, Dan, you mainly work with younger grades?
I work with 10th graders in the high school, but then when I do outreach stuff, when I'm in the public libraries, frequently I'm working with elementary age kids.
I was asking because I mainly work with older kids,
right,
and you work with all the grade levels, right? Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. I worked in the classroom directly with high school. I had a high school history classroom. And so that was where my direct classroom experience is, but I've worked with from pre-K all the way into college as well, doing curriculum development, doing mentoring, doing different work with comics and with literacy, and then again with that focus directly to world history in particular, and bringing comics into that.
And as an artist and a business owner, what do you do?
I own a business called Nails Y'all. I draw tiny pictures and portraits on fingernails. So if you guys need fancy nails, come see me.
Everyone needs fancy nails.
I agree.
Next we have Bram. Mian, did I say it right? Mian, sorry. And you came all the way here from New Mexico. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
My background's in graphic design. That's my profession. I am involved in writing and producing comics. With a group called 7000 BC, which is a nonprofit out of north central New Mexico that supports comic creators and also offers education programs. We're out at table 43 in the hall. And I have developed and taught comics creating classes at the college level, and also as part of 7000 BC and other outreach, done workshops in high school and junior high school in comics. And so I'm working with a few teachers and trying to build up kind of more of a presence of bringing comics as part of the curriculum, specifically in English.
And then you have your design work on Bram letters, and Bram Mian?
Yeah, Bram letters. I do comic book lettering and production, and then Bram Mian's my professional design site. I'm the only Bram Mian on the internet. If you search, you'll get me.
You are a lucky, lucky man.
No, sometimes.
I am not the only Kevin Garcia on the internet. However, I am the only one that owns kevingarcia.com. So the other ones all had to add something to their name. I have been a teacher for 12 years, and I've taught all over Texas now. I currently teach at the Liberal Arts and Science Academy, where I teach students publishing. Basically, they make magazines, make their own publications and graphic designs. I'm also a freelance writer. I used to write for newspapers. Now I do some freelance work for Marvel Comics, which is really fun to say, but all I really do is help out with the official handbook of the Marvel Universe Department, which means I write biographies of superheroes, that kind of stuff.
That still sounds fun.
It means that all the comics I buy are technically part of my job, so that's my excuse when I go to the comic book store every week. I also have a blog, monomythic.com, where I talk about education stuff occasionally, history stuff, superhero stuff. But since I don't get paid for it and get no advertising off it, I have not updated it since May, so I'll update it when I can. All right, so we're each going to talk about some of the ways we've used comics and graphic novels in education. And I was going to go ahead and start with this. I wanted to start with the obvious. There is one book that is one of the standards that just about every high school library has, and that is Mouse. If you have not read it, this is a really good book, and I always introduce it the same way. This is the true story of Nazi cats and Jewish mice. And by that I mean the artist is telling his father's story about his survival in Auschwitz. His father and mother both were concentration camp survivors. And I'm not sure specifically why he chose to do it as anthropomorphic animals and not humans. He's talked about it several times, but I imagine, though, that a big part of that is it's an emotional subject. And it's very, very hard to give this emotional subject when you are really personally connected to it. If you can make them cartoons, it gets cartoon animals especially. It makes it a little bit more distant. This also illustrates a problem that I have when people look at comics in education. The first thing I usually hear from administrators or sometimes parents is, why would you use comics? Aren't they for little kids? Especially since I teach high school, usually seniors. There's this thing that a lot of schools like looking at right now called Lexile levels, which is you type the words of a book into a computer, it gives them a number, and it tells them this is a certain age group. So this book shows up as, I think, a 6th grade book or something like that. And if you look at the pictures that are here, this is definitely not a child's book. This is a book for people to actually learn not just about some historical experiences, but also some personal experiences. In fact, having read this book with students before, the most emotionally painful stuff, for me anyway as a reader, is not the Holocaust stuff. It's the modern day portion of the story where you're learning about his mother's mental illness and the family's personal problems. And it's just, you don't expect that. You expect going in, oh, I'm going to learn about World War II. And no, there's so many other levels. There's a reason that this book has actually won, I believe it won the Pulitzer Prize. Yeah, so I think it's the only graphic novel to officially win the Pulitzer Prize. Going to the other end of the spectrum, got Yotsuba. This is, I'll be honest with you, I'm not a big manga and anime fan, although I do have quite a few that I like, but this is a book I believe everybody needs to read, even if you don't read manga. It is about a little, I guess 3 or 4-year-old little girl, and she recently moved to the big city in Japan from out in the middle of nowhere with her dad, and everything is exciting to her. She sees the air conditioning unit, she's like, what is that? It's amazing. She sees a swing set, what is that? And it just never gets old. It's so exciting. And I've actually used this book to teach English language learners. Students that are in high school but came from another country do not have trouble, rather, speaking and reading English. And although it has normal English, the translation obviously, because they're explaining everything to the child, and it's adorable. They are, in the process, basically explaining everything they are saying, step by step. And it's not really talking down, because you're not being talked down to as a reader. It's just a fun book. There's a similar book that I wanted to use called, I think, Chi at Home, or something like that, about a little cat. But the official English translation uses baby talk. And I can't use that for English language learners. So I saw a fan translation online, and I was like, oh, this is perfect. I should use this. And I went to go buy the book, and it was like, where are you, Mommy? And I'm like, no, I can't do that. Moving a little bit further along in their ability to read, I have used Superman, the original comic strips from the newspaper, to introduce people to the idea of reading comics, because you'd be surprised how many students I've had that said, what box do I read first? Now, I mean, that actually came up with manga because, it reads backwards, but these are people that were talking about any comic. And I use the Superman dailies because it has the original origin of Jor-El and Laura in Krypton and what happened to baby Kal-El and all that stuff. And everybody in the world has heard Superman's story. So I have them read that comic. And then I have them read the radio script to the exact same thing. And then I play them a clip of the Richard Donner movie. And I do this because I show how the same exact story can be told different ways. And the idea that you can have something go from one medium to another, and it totally changes feeling depending on the person telling the story or how they're putting it out there. And then I usually turn this around and have the students make their own comics. We read this book. I want you to take a scene from Beowulf and pick the scene, draw it in panels. One thing I like doing, especially when I have people that come into a class that they don't want to be in, I said I'm teaching publishing right now, but for the longest time I was teaching English, and everybody has to take an English class. And it, it can be a slog for some people. So I'm like, I start off with something innocuous. Scott Pilgrim. There's a scene in Volume 2, which is just a flashback, little self-contained, like 12-page story of him in high school. And it's great because not only can I read that just 12 pages and call it a day, but they also made an animation of it that you can find on the internet, which they made to promote the movie when it came out. And it's actually really good because, again, people that are afraid to read, I say, look, we're going to read the entire story on day one. Let's do it. And we read it, we watch the animation. And what's really fun is when I have some students, high school students that have watched the movie, and they're always like, how come he's not with Ramona? Who's this other girl? And I'm like, guys, that was high school. I like being mean to high school students sometimes. And then there's the adaptation process as well. I love, if we're going to read an entire novel, changing it up as much as possible. So I will take, for example, the book Ender's Game, and we'll read one chapter. Instead of reading the book chapter, we'll read the comic chapter. Or instead of reading this chapter, we'll watch the clip of the video, because the movie had some of the scenes pretty straightforward, even though they cut out a lot. I did that having never read Ender's Game, and it actually worked out really well, but it actually had a side benefit in that there were a few chapters of Ender's Game that, as an adult, really didn't read well, but as a child, people don't catch up on. So when we read the comic book version, they removed all of the naked children, so it wasn't a big deal. They were wearing clothing in the comic book version. Yeah, just seriously, Ender's Game, it's got some issues. Even though I know it's a lot of people's favorite book as a kid, I read it as an adult, and I think that affects why I don't like it. Sorry. And now the big one. This is one of the other books, along with Neil Gaiman's books, that are considered to be literary classics, despite being comic books, because for some reason that makes it a negative. Watchmen is one of those books that everybody says they need to read someday, and many people have. It is extremely dense, but it's mostly dense because it's not just a comic book. You see up here, I have a page, the first page actually, but at the end of every chapter, at the end of every issue, they have this supplemental material. So you'd be reading a chapter of a novel, somebody's memoir, you'd be reading a Time Magazine interview, or you'd be reading a police report. Visually, this also does a lot for storytelling. Every issue, if you have the original issues, or in the collected version that has the chapter covers, has an extreme close-up. And then the very next panel on the very first page is pulling out, and then pulling out, and pulling out, pulling out, pulling out. Every single issue of Watchmen, every chapter of Watchmen does that. And it's one of those things that if you just read the collected version, and maybe they don't have, because some of the collected versions don't have the covers in properly, you won't catch it, but it's really, really neat as a storytelling technique. And I'm going to stop there. We're going to talk more later on, but I'd like to pass this off to Bram, who's going to tell us about Scott McCloud.
So I'm coming at this from two kind of teaching angles. One was being called on to develop and teach a class in creating comics at the college level. Santa Fe University of Art and Design approached me and wanted me to teach comics to a bunch of graphic design students within the graphic design program. And that's my background, graphic design, visual communications. And even though I did wind up pretty much with just strictly graphic designers in my first class, it was always intended to be open to everyone else and all majors. So over the course of it, I had photographers, I had film majors, I had creative writing majors. And because it was within the graphic design program, that's my background, and we were going to be honest that nobody really taking the class was going to go on to a career in comics. I wanted it to be a little bit more broad overview of kind of visual communication in general, and kind of use it to really teach some core graphic design principles, visual communication principles, while getting everyone to be able to do comics. And I'm not a trained illustrator. It's been way too long since I've attempted to draw. So I wasn't even getting into, like, this is how you draw folds or hands or something. It was really going to be very much a hands-on experience of what the pieces are to a comic. And so I really drew heavily on understanding comics, which I'm hoping most of you have read or at least heard of. I tend to recommend it to anybody who even has to communicate with other humans, because it just really gets into some amazing insight into perception. And I read this in my 20s after having a graphic design degree and reading comics all my life, and it blew my mind. So this really kind of formed the very strong basis, because he does really delve into like a lot of the basics of how we perceive things, how our minds work. This is how comics specifically use them. I was able to use a lot of the principles too for kind of more general visual communication sorts of things. Also in the class, like kind of unintentionally or somewhat intentionally, I kind of turned into like a creative life skills kind of class, because comics was a great jumping off point for being able to discuss things like why deadlines, working intelligently and smartly, how to plan your time, because as a creative professional, you're going to have to build for this. And so comics, in many ways, was just such a great structure because it's got this kind of these finite borders that you can figure out, like, a graphic novel is daunting, but a graphic novel is made of pages. We can figure out what a page is. Pages are made of panels. We can figure out what a panel is. And so it really kind of allowed just the general creative process to flow. What also was great, too, is no matter how confident the students were, because what I got was a lot of students who'd drawn pinups of Wolverine. And so now suddenly you had to put a story together, and that just kind of messed everyone up. And there was a moment, one of my favorite moments was I assigned one of the projects was a 3-panel gag strip. You have to do just something in 3 panels. And one of the guys came in because he was so excited, he had so much fun, he did like a whole page story. Like, Diego, you have to go back and do 3 panels. And he was just like freaked out with like how difficult it was to do 3 over 9. And so that sort of thing was really kind of what I'm working with. That's something that you can take no matter what kind of communication that you're getting into and have it be relatable to your career. I was called on to do an advanced class. One of the other textbooks I used in the main class is Drawing Words, Writing Pictures, which Megan's going to talk about. In advanced class, I kind of centered around Mastering Comics by Jessica Abel and Matt Madden. My second level class, I called my first one was a graphic design class, masquerading as a sequential art class. This was a writing class, masquerading as sequential art. So I really kind of took a bunch of people, and I at this point had pretty higher level illustrators, people that were accomplished, and generally in visual development major, once they were doing concept art. So they had some chops, and now I made them write a story. Literally spent like the first 4 weeks just writing on index cards before they drew. But this book provides a structure. So you're going to hit on Drawing Words, Writing Pictures. Drawing Words, Writing Pictures is structured basically as a 16-week class. So you can use it. You can take that book and teach it as a class. There's homework in there. There's how to run critiques. I kind of cut it up and jumped around in it. There were parts we didn't cover. There were parts we spent more time on. Mastering Comics, kind of as my second class wound up being, where it's like a deep dive into one project. So Mastering Comics really is good guidance for anyone who's going to spend 16 weeks basically on one project. And there's a lot in there that's kind of, beyond just what goes into making comics. She gets into going to a convention. How do you market yourself there? In this class, I also had them do, they had to do some teaching. I'll get to that in a moment. And actually the class culminated in them printing and producing a comic and going to the comic shop at an event, sitting behind the table and selling it. And that's a pretty intense experience for any of you who've done that. And it was kind of a good way to like have them feel like they concluded this project and they just did it and they survived it and they can go out and make more. In my thinking, especially developing the level 2 class, this was very important. Lynda Berry's syllabus. Lynda Berry was invited by, I think it was a branch of University of Wisconsin-Madison, David Krakauer, to teach a class in kind of just visual thinking. And it was not for artists. It was predominantly like scientists. And so she did a journal of her teaching in the form of the syllabi and notes she drew, which are all like these notes from sketchbook pages. And she's just got some terrific insight. She's doing really next level thinking about like what is image and how do we conceive of things, where do ideas come from. She's got some amazing exercises in there, but she's also got some really fun, like fast-paced, like just getting people over the fear of drawing. That was one of the, for any of you who might be dealing with a class or students who are unwilling to draw, they're unwilling to make something bad. She's got some great insight and some exercises that are specifically designed to get students over this because, like I said, she was dealing with predominantly like scientists. So these were people who didn't even want to draw a figure. And so she came up with all these exercises to get them over it and to get them storytelling regardless of it. So kind of over in the other world, I work with a couple English teachers in Santa Fe teaching. I come and do workshops. And one of the first ones I did was teacher wanted to do Hellboy as part of like a series on Gothic horror. And he, kind of like you, wanted to like look at, it wasn't exactly the same story told in different ways, but like these were some commonalities. He wanted to throw Hellboy in because it's like, it's hitting on some pretty classic themes of the monster outsider and such, but do it in a visual sense. And so I actually use, what's funny is you chose a panel I used in teaching about time in my college class, because there's a lot of really sophisticated storytelling going on in Hellboy, but it was also very approachable and relatable for the students. And so when I came in to teach this, I basically taught a quick workshop on what goes into making a comic. And again, that was always like I always make the students do the work. You know, we're going to draw this thing, we're going to talk about, we're going to draw this thing, we're going to put these things together, and hey, what do you know? You've made a comic, and now you've identified the bits and pieces of what go into it. And that helps them read it differently than they otherwise would if they hadn't had kind of that background. And I find that the hands-on, making them sit and draw, like that really kind of focuses their attention on a lot of things. They find out exactly how hard it is to draw simple, what it takes to get across an emotion. And especially for an English class, for to walk in and say, hey, well, you've got a guest teacher and you're just gonna be drawing pictures all day, that kind of makes their day until they start drawing. That same teacher brought me in to teach Persepolis, or to prepare them to teach Persepolis. He teaches at an international baccalaureate school, and Persepolis is one of the books that's on the curriculum, I think, for the junior year. And so he was going to have the students do that, and so brought me in. And this is actually where I brought in my advanced college class to teach, because I wanted them to have the experience of teaching. And still, it was still structured in the way I usually do the workshops, where it was hands-on. We're going to draw this, we're going to analyze it. But a lot of what we were doing in this class was vocabulary and kind of a basis for analysis, because as part of the program, these students have to write an essay, and they could write it on one of the graphic novels that they read. And I wanted them to have the language of comics as opposed to just purely the language of literature. And so introduced even to such basic terminology, or just some ideas for what you should be looking for when you're talking about analyzing and criticizing comics versus prose literature, and kind of give them that toolbox. One of the students actually got a perfect score on her Persepolis essay because we were able to approach teaching and thinking about comics differently than we were teaching and thinking about prose literature. Okay. And then the last one I think we're probably going to hit on a lot here today. Most recently I was brought in to teach or prepare students to read American-born Chinese. It was a 7th grade English class. An English teacher really kind of had no experience herself with reading comics. She just kind of knew that this probably needed to be included. And she was lucky enough to just kind of drop it in the curriculum and no one really questioned. But she realized that she kind of needed some of the background to prepare the students to read it. And it was kind of funny. We met and I didn't know what she was going to teach, and I brought that copy. I said, my copy. She's like, what are you going to teach? I'm thinking American-born Chinese. I'm like, that's pretty much what I recommend for any introduction or first time anyone's reading a graphic novel. And in this case, we did, again, like some very rapid-fire hands-on exercises. And what they did, their assignment was to do an autobiographical mini-comic. So they actually had to go and make one. That was their final assignment. And for anyone who's made it, a comic, they waited till too much the last minute. They didn't really fully appreciate how much work went into it. So I actually got to critique works in progress where we thought it was going to be critiquing the finished product. And that worked out so well that we're now scheduling that in there. But really kind of got them to break down a story about their lives and think visually about it. And American-born Chinese just kind of offers so many levels of analysis too. From just the story to the structure of the story to even the art. So it gave them a lot of really good points to talk about. And the thing about American-born Chinese is it's kind of deceptively simple. You look at it and it seems like very simple and straightforward, but there's so many layers. So it's really kind of very, very approachable. So that's kind of the two areas I'm coming at this from. And I suspect we're probably going to talk more about secondary education, but there we go.
All right. A couple of those books are books I use as well in Persepolis. And both Persepolis and American-born Chinese take. The first school I taught at was 99% Hispanic, and a lot of these students had never met anyone outside of their own, community. So this really opened them up to ideas of like, hey, the rest of the world is out there.
Did you find one work better than another?
Persepolis did a lot for letting students who had never left South Texas see that somebody who grew up in Iran could grow up the same way they did. And that just blew a lot of their minds. So, yeah. Megan? You're going to talk to us about drawing words and writing pictures.
Actually, I'm just going to bounce off Persepolis real quick, if that's
Go for
okay.
it.
So I taught it in a history classroom, so that's a little bit different, right? I'm not teaching it to ELA students. There wasn't quite the focus on creating or understanding comics quite at the same level as you would have in an English classroom, right? We're reading it more to connect it kind of as supplement, right? So they were actually learning about the Iranian Revolution, right? So a lot of these kids, I was teaching in the South Bronx, they don't necessarily have like an innate connection to the revolution, but you throw in a story about teenage rebellion and about music and about, with a relatable protagonist, and all of a sudden you've got a way to connect all these facts that they do have to know for their state exams up there in the region. You've now got that connected to these visual cues, and they're able to connect, Persepolis in a way that not only builds empathy, but it does build content knowledge. So I really like that one. Okay, let's jump into this one. The drawing words and writing pictures. So while I did teach history, I also worked in a different capacity with, like we were saying earlier, kids in like pre-K through college. And there's one particular exercise that I actually got the pleasure of doing with Jessica Abel. And it's, I don't know what the technical name is, but it's the Pinguino exercise, if you guys are familiar. And so you get, this is great if you're not teaching like necessarily like a class about comics, right? Because you may have some reluctant drawers or things like that. So what this exercise does is to kind of take away all of that, not creativity, but take away like the forced, like now you've got to create characters, you've got to make them do things. This is actually like a lottery system where you guys as a class are creating a comic. So that's kind of a fun way that I had a lot of luck with introducing kids, again, at all levels. I would modify it for little ones, but I've done it with, adults as well. And it's a fun way to get people working as a group, but also kind of understanding the basic format of comics and using that vocabulary. I taught mouse as well, and again, more from a history standpoint than for reading in an English classroom. In general, I found that comics were a really great tool to use with my classroom that on any given day was full of English language learners from Africa, all over Latin America, the Middle East, right? So I was working with all sorts of reading levels, language levels, all of these different things, and introducing graphic novels and comics, right? Especially things like Owly, which I know is coming up next, and Bone, were a really great way to engage maybe a reluctant reader or a reader who was an English language learner. Bone I found especially helpful with my middle schoolers and specifically the boys. There was a lot of adventure in it, and they were able to pursue like the next one in the series, which was really exciting. And also for some of these kids, it really was the first time they went on their own to the library to like get the next book. So I had a lot of luck with that one. And then so March. I taught a world history classroom, and it was actually this. So this wouldn't really have fit into my curriculum, but I can easily see this and also Chinese-born American fitting into a social studies curriculum, not just outside of an ELA classroom.
I was just going to add that this book was inspired by a book that the author had read when he was younger, and I wanted to make sure to include that cover in the middle is that book that he was inspired by when he was younger. That he saw this comic about Martin Luther King, and when as an adult, he wanted to kind of replicate that experience. So he was really hoping young people would pick this up. So
it's incredibly engaging. It's a great story, and I mean, it's got it's got like first person right from John Lewis. So it is a historical document in a lot of ways. I mean, it reprints I Have a Dream speech. It reprints all of these things. So you could really use it to enhance like a kid's understanding of the civil rights movement. Okay, so here's Owly. I love this one. But this is really good too, just in teaching like a basic understanding of comics. Obviously, this has no impact on a history classroom, but what it is good for is like, again, a reluctant reader or also an English language learner, right? Because the cool thing about Owly, if you haven't read it, there are no words. So it's just like they'll do like exclamation marks or a butterfly or things to convey all these feelings, which also opens up an interesting discussion of language and all of these different ideas too of how you can convey, how you can use art to convey all of these different feelings and emotions and thoughts. So this was an interesting experience I had where I used that. This was not a classroom experience, but this was a mentoring experience where I worked a couple years ago with this young lady, super talented artist, great imagination. Also, she has Asperger's. And so this was an interesting one where she came to me as we were working on a graphic novel she was working on. And so she came to me and she said she was really having a hard time like convincingly building a relationship and dialogue between her two female protagonists. And this was, a side effect of her having Asperger's and having, I guess, to create a different kind of understanding of these emotional bonds. And so I reached into my own collection and I lent her this one, which I know I do have a friend who's an English teacher in AISD who does provide this one to a lot of her students as well. And this is just such a great story if you haven't read it, just for your own enjoyment. But it really gave the girl I was working with like a really great understanding of how a female friendship, a close, intimate friendship is formed. And I think it really informed her going on with her graphic novel.
I was just going to add that I'm really glad that you said that you use this in history classes, because usually when I talk to people about comics, they just say, oh, well, that's just English.
Sure.
Like, you can use it in other places. They actually make comics specifically for math and science, although I'll be honest, a lot of the ones that I've seen out there are not the most engaging,
Sure.
but it's a start. There are actually some comics that take things like the creation of the universe or Einstein's theories. There was one I read several years ago that was about the entire comic was a conversation between Darwin and a mite that lived in his eyebrow.
Yep.
And I really loved that book. I need to find that again.
Yeah, I'm blanking. It's the guy who did something called Clan Apis, too. The whole thing was about the life cycle of the bee.
Yes.
Jay Hostler.
I was just, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, and then I will, if you give me a moment.
Okay, yeah. I was just going to add, there's definitely a lot of content that you can bring into a history classroom, but also the really cool thing about comics is you give students the opportunity to create content or to show me that they understand their work, right? They can explain the Industrial Revolution by creating, some panels to explain it to me. And that just gives me a way to see whether or not they do understand what they're supposed to be learning and where I need to go in and kind of fix that. And it also gives, an artistic kid a fun way to explain something that isn't an essay.
I was going to ask what hit me is, so when you were using Persepolis around your comics and history class, did you get any pushback from administration and parents about that? Or how did you introduce comics within the flow of the whole thing?
Okay, so I had a really unique situation because teaching in the South Bronx is pretty unique in itself. One of the really amazing benefits, maybe, is that you don't have a ton of oversight. And as long as your kids, the kids have to pass the Regents at the end of the year. And as long as they're getting there, you're kind of left to your own devices. So I know from talking with other teachers in other districts, including, AISD, that may not be the case for everyone. So I didn't have a problem, but.
Switching over to Dan, you have a extensive knowledge of comics, being there surrounded by awesome books and comics. I've actually not heard of Descender yet. I've seen images of it around. What is this?
It's a great book, and it's got some beautiful artwork and an incredible story. It's a fun science fiction space opera, and it's based around a young boy who's also a robot. So there's a lot of appeal to the book there. But I went into it at the end of the school year with graders, and what I'm trying to do on a day-to-day basis is create curriculum that dovetails with the state standards and is going to be appealing enough to my co-teachers on my team. They will be interested in maybe using that as well, and that will also have some sort of affective hook for my students. So this is a cool space opera, but it's also a story of how the young robot is in a world where giant robots have threatened the security of this entire federation of planets, and therefore all of these robots that have been constructed but are living as citizens among all the planets, all of a sudden people have said, well, all we know is these are robots, so we're getting rid of all the robots. And my students, so I brought my students into this and allowed them to kind of make some observations as we began reading it. And we were just reading the first chapter. We didn't read the entire, it's an ongoing series. So we read the first chapter of the book. And my students were making observations as they go in. I try to make as much of that their experience as possible, that affective part of them noticing things. And they started thinking, that's not really right. That doesn't make sense. So they started drawing parallels to their personal lives, to current events, and were able to spin that into academic writing. And we didn't do any pieces, we didn't do any process pieces with this particular book that were composed in comics. This particular piece we had fairly little time with at the end of the year. So students read it, had discussion time in class, had some really good discussions, and then spun that off into some academic writing. But there are some other pieces that my students have been able to go into and not only make those effective connections, but then also connect them back to other literature that we've read, prose literature included, and then create compositions of comic books and other things, and poetry and things like that. Bram was talking about how incredible understanding comics is just a way of, by Scott McCloud, understanding comics of just having a narrative to understand exactly what art is or how communication works as an ongoing thing in society. And my students didn't read that, but Scott McCloud actually had a Q&A at the local comic book store one time, and I asked him, I'm teaching these works in a 10th grade public high school class. What should I be doing? And he said, well, great, have them read the books, have them respond academically, have them also respond academically in the medium of comic, have them compose. And if you don't have, because my background is not as an artist, I don't have any formal training of any sort of graphic design or anything like that, just as a personal fan of comics for 40 odd years. So he said, even if you don't have the personal rubric to be a critique of that, they can create that work and put it up on the wall, and they can do their own critiques and say, oh, that didn't work that well. I need to do something different the next time. So there are some of these other pieces that they did have more different connections to.
When you mentioned this earlier, you mentioned Dark Knight Returns, and I was kind of curious on that. Is this something that you've used in a classroom before that you feel could be classroom ready, or maybe you just really loved the movie and said we need to?
I didn't use the entire book. I enjoyed the book tremendously when I was in high school and it came out. I didn't use the entire book. I just, again, used the first chapter. And you can use a short piece like that, and that way you can enter some of the themes of the work. But if you don't have the time or want to move on or want to attach it to some other work that you want to make connections to, then that works well as just using one chapter. Incidentally, a lot of current comic books, the publisher and just all the different publishers will put out a $1 reprint of the first issue. So if you're an educator and you're looking for a classroom set and you're on your own budget and you have a classroom with about 30 students, then for $30 you've got a classroom set of an entire chapter of the book that you can study together.
That's how I have a classroom set of the first issue of Watchmen, and actually all I ever use in that is that at this point anyway, I've only ever used the first issue, the first chapter of Watchmen, but it came in really handy that DC had put out that $1 issue to try it, and it became my class set.
So when we went into that, surprisingly, not all of my students are super excited when I tell them we're going to be reading graphic novels. That I have some students who are like, oh, we're going to be reading Batman in English class. Okay, or whatever. So we went into this. This was a couple of years ago when Batman, or year before last, when Batman versus Superman came out, and it obviously had a lot of imagery that visually drew upon this particular book by Frank Miller. So I brought it in because I thought that they would make that initial connection to it. But also there's that affective connection that we started reading it, and they're thinking, okay, I'm reading a comic book about Batman. But this is an imaginary story about Batman. Aren't they all imaginary stories? But this is an imaginary story about Batman in which he's kind of old and grizzled and out of retirement for a while and comes back into being Batman to combat the Joker and other threats. But so this is a kind of an alternate version of Batman. And what Frank Miller really does with this, so my students had to understand first a little bit about 1980s culture when this book came out, which of course my 10th graders did not know anything about the 1980s. We talked about it first, and they proved their knowledge is pretty minimal. So we talked about some things that were going on in current events in the 1980s. And so then reading into the social satire that's in the book, and also reading into the fact that Frank Miller in this book really draws into the idea of Batman would be a pretty deeply flawed human being. And maybe he's not even really a good guy. So it really kind of forced students to think about, like, if someone were trying to do these things in a context of things that were going on in the world, how would I feel about this? So then they, we took news articles and we took things like that, and they responded with, in connection to that. So this is a creator named Rachel Maslamani. And I encountered her work. She's from Pittsburgh. And I encountered her work because of a book that we're going to show you the cover of in a moment that's called The Graphic Novel Classroom by Maureen Bacchus. And Maureen Bacchus recommended this artist's work. So I was like, it's already worked in the classroom. Let me look at this and see if it'll work for my students. Deep, effective connection with my students here. This particular work that you see projected behind me is one of her short pieces called Two Kinds of People. And that's a quote from the very end of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So I played them that clip, and we can kind of look at that. But the piece is about, and it seems like a memoir. It's a very personal piece. And the character in the piece is talking about her experiences through school with a heritage that's both Asian and European. And my students, after reading this and after doing a little bit of their initial observations of it, I had students with that affective connection who came to me individually afterwards and said, I've never had a piece in an English class or any of my classes that spoke to the fact that in my life, every single year of my life, somebody has come up to me and asked me, where are you from? Or what ethnicity are you? And don't understand the inappropriateness of that question or the way they asked it. And nobody's ever spoke to that feeling that I had before. So they made a deep, effective connection with it. And this was a piece that a lot of people referred back to when they were creating their own comic books. It really drew them into the idea that I can refer to something in an academic way, and at the same time, I'm drawing on my own unique experience as a human being. And these are the covers of these two academic books that I've used a lot that have really helped me as a teacher, just providing background information. Maureen Bacchus's book, The Graphic Novel Classroom, has a lot of great methodology stuff that provides some information, to provide some lessons on what to do with American-born Chinese, the novel by Jean Yang, and recommended to me the piece by Rachel Maslamani. Lots of good methodology. This is what you can do in your classroom. The other book is by a person named Terry Thompson, and he, I believe, is based in Texas. And this is a great book. He's a middle school teacher and has had a long career in education, primarily middle school. And he's worked with many populations of students, frequently ESL students. And he's got a lot of great data and research in his book. So if you're looking on bringing your graphic novel unit or your artist in the classroom into your program in your public school, and you're wondering how that's going to be perceived by your administrators or by your co-teachers, this provides a lot of background for this is why we do this. Because students who struggle with their reading for any reason on a variety of different levels benefit from that immense added context in comic books. That it's not just a supplemental to academic real reading, that it's its own, obviously it's its own medium, and that it deserves an entire media study in that context.
Now, you also have some samples of your student work?
Yes, yeah. So this is some of the work that my students created. As I said, I don't have any any background as an art teacher in providing groundwork for them to create artwork. I just go through a lot of stuff that I got from Scott McCloud on exactly what this medium looks like and how you navigate the connection between words and pictures. And some of my students, of course, are already talented artists, and some of them have never done anything like this before. And these are some of the things that they've created. And some of these pieces, I don't know how well you can see the individual panels, but some of these pieces are responding to that Rachel Maslamani piece, and the students are talking about their own experiences and their own individual uniqueness in their lives. And this is one I really like to use as an example. And by the way, all of these students, all the pieces I'm presenting to you were not only presented to me as assignments, but these are pieces that students allowed me to include in a literary magazine that we put together. So the students who put these pieces together had created versions that they felt were polished enough that they wanted those to go out into the world and people to see those. So this was a piece that a student created, and what I love about this is the levels of complexity. What he did here is after having read American-Born Chinese and Rachel Maslamani's piece, he made personal connections to his own life about how I asked students to think with this assignment about how because some of my students, had read American-Born Chinese, and they said, well, I don't really have any personal relationship to the idea of coming from two different heritages or navigating those, I don't feel like I have any perception of navigating racism against me or my own preconceived ideas. And I said, well, your piece doesn't have to be about that. Your piece is about you. So think about what you've experienced where you have two different expectations in different parts of your lives. Different groups of people have different expectations for you. So this student was responding to that with his own personal life and weaving into it what he'd read with American-Born Chinese and weaving into it literary connections to the prose novel Purple Hibiscus by Chimamanda Adichie, which he read that previous summer, in literary comparative fiction, comparative literature, and then tying that all together at the end for the conclusion. And I thought that was a remarkably connected piece.
Okay, just on a practical sense, those assignments, were they given requirements as to graphic elements they had to use? I mean, did you kind of lay out any sort of you must demonstrate these kind of transition things, or what did the assignment for these look like?
I did. So they had, and my students had options. They're in that literary magazine. There were other pieces that were poetry or that were prose or that were nonfiction that were responding to the same thing. But I did require that all the pieces had some sort of reference to the themes in the literature that they'd read, and some sort of textual evidence as a literary skill, because I do have to connect these back to the essential skills.
So it wasn't really any visual requirements. They were completely free to interpret comics how they wanted.
Exactly. And I also I allowed them to use, there's some websites out there where you basically plug your script into stock images that the website provides, and it puts them into word bubbles and things like that. And I allowed students to do that, and they saw how difficult that process was. That even if they weren't creating their own visual line work, it was still a process of composition. And then the students who were talented artists, more talented artists than I would be visually, experienced that composition process.
I always have a student ask me for this kind of a project, can I just use stick figures? And I usually show them XKCD. And I point out, this guy is now a millionaire based on his stick figures. If you can do stick figures like that, yes. Otherwise, I really want some more depth. Usually, I require there to be a color element, because usually if I'm going to have them do a comic strip, I give them enough time, they can make it a complete project. And usually it'll be the more artistic students. They'll ask if they can only do black and white. And it's usually worth it, because they'll do a lot of shading and stuff. It's an English class, so I don't worry too much on the art, but I do want it to be worth it. I want it to be, it's graphic. So it needs to be visual.
Every class from the junior high to college, I always offer the option of doing, you can just do this whole thing in stick figures. It's like and nobody ever takes me up on it because it's the whole, once you realize how tough it is to do something simple.
Yes.
Yeah,
exactly.
you'd rather take on something bigger. Yeah.
This is some of the more textual work they're doing, where this is a response journal, a dialectical journal, where they're taking observations that they made from the piece on the left side, and on the right side, their inferences that they've made from the direct observations. So this is an image of some of the more verbal prose academic sort of work that they're doing. And I usually use these dialectical journals toward the beginning of having read something, so that they can begin to make those connections and observations for themselves about what the themes of this might be.
I have something similar to this that I've used, that I make as general as possible, trying to show them how anything can be seen as a story, anything can be seen as a history, anything can be seen as valid, and it'll be the same form whether we're watching a video clip or related form, a video clip or a comic strip or reading a short story. And the idea being they're still looking for these same elements because they're still complete stories that we're watching or reading or participating in.
Can we digress and jump on that? Because the question I had
Actually,
for you
for
specifically, although I suppose anyone. So what I found interesting is that you take the same story and you tell them, you offer it in different adaptations in media. How do you work with like what the strengths of each ones are? Do you kind of like analyze that? Do you kind of just like, compare the differences? Do you have them play to their strengths? What do you do?
To me, it all comes down to one book, which unfortunately there is a comic book version, but it's not the best version of it. And that's The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I use that one because it is the only property that I'm aware of that has been a movie, a TV show, a video game, a book, a radio play, and a stage play, and all of them were written by the same person. The only reason I say not the comic book because he wasn't involved in the comic. But he purposely changed his story depending on the strength of the medium. So if a joke was visual but fast, it'd go in a movie. But if a joke was visual but could be called upon later, it could be in the TV show. If one bit was more cerebral, it'd only be in the book version. And if one relied heavily on using your own imagination, to be in the radio version. And I use that as an example of that. And then basically from that idea, Superman, for example, right? The first time we see Superman's homeworld in the comics, in the original comics in the 30s, it was just one panel of Krypton exploding. And then it said he came to Earth, he was raised, and now he's an adult. They didn't even show the Kents, all right? So the first time that we actually saw Jor-El and Lara and the actual home life was in the newspaper strips. And because it was a daily strip, they could take a long time to tell it. So the original creators wrote the newspaper strip, and they took a long time to tell Jor-El's story before they ever got to Superman, right? And then the radio play is mostly about Superman, but they still wanted to introduce it. So they took all that Jor-El stuff and shortened it down into just the bit of him arguing with the scientists on the planet. And then, of course, you have the Richard Donner version where they took it and made it this epic level. So it was depending on what the medium was, how they told the same story. So when I have them take a book and turn it to a comic strip, I tell them, you have to decide what elements are visual and what elements will still make the reader know, hey, this is from Beowulf, this is from Gilgamesh, this is from the Canterbury Tales. And the idea being that they learn in their own head what is the element that is important here, and then bring it out in the image. So regardless of what level of artist they are, they're still able to do that.
It's on one of my assignments that I did, and I adapted from a friend of mine who taught, where one of the first big ones my college students do is a fairy tale adaptation. It hits on some of those things where like suddenly you have to figure out, I give them 6 pages to adapt a fairy tale. For some that's too long, and some that's not enough. And so it's exactly that thing where they have to start to take a look at what's important to the story and shave away everything that else isn't, while also thinking in this case like it's a visual medium. So even if like this rambling monologue is important, maybe you want to come up with a different way of handling that.
Yeah, exactly. A monologue would not work well in a comic strip. By the way, we'd love to take questions from you guys as well. So if anybody has either a question, a comment, a book you've used before, or one you think would be great in a classroom, we'd love to hear it. Just let us know.
I think looking at, I can't immediately think of any applications to math, but I'm sure there are. But in terms of science, I mean, going back to my history classroom, it's so easy to ask kids to explain something. You have a variety of ways that they can explain what they've learned, right? They can write you an essay, they can make you a graph, they can explain it to you verbally, but they can also make a comic strip. So, if you take a higher level concept, I don't know, aquatic science, your favorite fish, I don't know. So if you make a comic book or you make a comic and you share, even as a whole class, everyone's creating, contributing to what could become like a study guide comic book, something like that, right? You've now engaged kids in a very different level. You've also pulled in kids that might have trouble engaging with the curriculum as it's typically presented in a textbook form or anything like that. So yeah, I think that would be super cool and super fun.
Megan, have you ever used any outside texts in science or other STEM areas that as models or as ways of communicating content area information? Have you had any experience with anything?
I mean, yes, but in the historical sense
right,
of
yeah.
that.
There's a couple. First Second, I know, is doing a series of comics. It's going to be a little lower level sorts of things, but that's going on. But I think you might have mentioned earlier that like some of the science comics just kind of aren't compelling as comics. They're kind of like, yeah.
It depends. I was going to say, yeah, I mentioned earlier that there's some officially produced ones that, the intention is good, but the execution is lacking. That being said, there are a lot of academics out there. You mentioned comic professionals that are doing passion projects. There are a lot of academics out there that are trying to get their stuff into comics. So, for example, I know some criminal justice professors out of Houston, I think, that are working with some Ivy League people to publish comics based on criminal justice theory, criminal justice history, criminal justice elements that are needed. So not just the history of it or a story about it, but actually things that can be used as textbooks. I feel like there's something aquatic science that's on the tip of my tongue, but even if there wasn't, it's something that could be done. So it's like the idea that people that are interested in that area and want to teach that area reach out to artists that might be at indie comic conventions, right, and get together and make a project.
There's indie ones like I know Lucy Bellwood was doing some stuff where she was on a survey vessel. There was one, it was like I got SPX like 10 years ago. Someone who was studying walruses. So there's like one of the things to do is look at like these small independent things. But something I was going to kind of jumped off what you started to talk about there is it almost might work from the opposite direction, where instead of worrying about finding a comic to present them, you give the students permission to present their findings any way they want. I'm thinking of McCloud, of course, but there's this one scene where he demonstrates how kids explain things. It's between this verbal, and you stop and you talk. It might be kind of almost a thing of exercises by which you lead the students through what's the best way to present the information, and like in that way comics kind of sneak in. But I mean, I think a lot of it is just kind of like, what can you turn over, and like, can you do some of the exercises in some of these comic things to just kind of get people thinking that way? Because that starts to get into like my other half of graphic design, data visualization. Like there's just so much not thought going into how things are presented. It's just, this is the way it's always been done. Is this the best way to get it across? It seems that like comics would offer some interesting opportunities in STEM areas for presenting information.
If I could mention a couple of things, I think if you want to source that Terry Thompson book, Adventures in Graphica, that I put up there, has some kind of background information that provides the support to be able to say this is where differentiation happens. So yeah, so that was kind of helpful. And I don't know, I feel like there are some, like maybe not as a textbook necessarily, but there are some STEM area books that would provide interesting discussion in a science classroom. I'm thinking right now of Climate Change by Eric Swarzoni. That would be an interesting piece to discuss in a science class.
And I think even if you don't want to, if you're having trouble finding like a whole graphic novel or textbook or something like that to incorporate, don't underestimate just like a panel from a newspaper, because I really enjoyed some like Far Side comics when I was in high school that they would throw up at the beginning. Yeah, and it starts a discussion. It kind of lightens the mood. So that's kind of a fun way to incorporate it very easily and kind of get kids thinking in that format too.
There's actually a series of well, not a series. There's actually several different web comics that I like, where Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal is one where the artist is clearly somebody who's interested in sociology, and so a lot of the jokes are inspired by that. Well, and I mentioned XKCD earlier, and that one, the artist is I'm guessing a mathematician, but he also throws in stuff that'll be like history-based jokes or biology or sociology. But it's that idea of them bringing in their field of expertise.
There was a series that just ended called Your Wild City. That was just kind of like, it was a look at, like here's robbing calls and stuff. And as a comic, it's kind of a little bit more illustrated diagrammatic stuff, but it's good fun. And there's another one that's two animals and blanking on what it's called now, bird and something.
Well, there's also Hark a Vagrant, which is great. That one's mostly history, but also some literature. And then there's a biology one that I really like. I'm trying to remember what it is right now. I have to find it. I have a lot of these linked on my website. I have a little button that says education. It's just a bunch of just sites that I found. On that note, to artists out there and indie artists that, I'd love my stuff to be picked up by kids and in schools. Here's a weird little thing. So Mouse has really mature themes, but it's also, it's recognized internationally as being this great work. Watchmen has a lot of nudity in it, but at the same time, it's recognized as really great work. It's a lot harder as a teacher for me to justify bringing in a new book when there is material in it that might be objectionable. And the problem that comes up is that people feel it has to be all or nothing. Like Owly is clearly intended to be, this is all ages. And then they say, well, if I'm doing an all ages book, it has to be for little kids. You can do a book that's for teenagers. I'm thinking of a book that I found at an indie comic fair that I really loved, and it had some time travel in it, history, and all this stuff in it. And it was really, and I'm like, I could put this on my shelf, and my teenagers would love this. And the very last page had the main characters looking at a nude magazine. And there was literally no nudity in the entire book until the last page. And yeah, Watchmen is up there. And yes, Watchmen has that credibility, but it's harder for me to justify that with a book that hasn't been discovered yet. So I don't want to tell people to censor themselves, but if you're writing something that could be picked up by a broad audience, keep that in mind. American-Born Chinese, for example, has really, really offensive stuff in it, but that's on purpose. It was part of the story. It is there to be offensive, and that's kind of how it got noticed. But if they just randomly threw an offensive joke in the last page and nothing else from that had been in the book, it wouldn't have been picked up. It never would have gotten on library shelves. It never would have, gone beyond the first publishing. The idea being that if you're an artist or you're a creator, I'm definitely not telling you to censor yourself, but keep that in mind. If the racist stuff or sexist stuff or violence or whatever else it is the theme and the message that you're trying to address, it makes sense. If it's just, I want to write this for adults, that's fine. But speaking as somebody who's tried to convince administrators, yes, let me bring this into the room, it gets harder if you throw that in the back. I had an administrator once tell me I could never include anything by Mark Twain because he has used the N-word. And I'm like, but in this book it doesn't show up. It's like, but he's used it before, hasn't he? So you got to be careful. And it's an odd thing to say. I know it's one of the things you're not supposed to say to a creator, but I feel like as an educator, it's something like, just be aware of that. I want to bring your stuff into the classroom. I want to bring it in so students can read it. But I got to get past that gatekeeping of the administration and the parents. They don't really care about content so much, but they really care about nudity and language. That's why when I cover Persepolis, I cover book 1, but I don't usually cover book 2, which is still a really good book. But it covers themes that are maybe more mature than what I want to address in the classroom. So it's just choice on my part.
And if you've got a book that you want to be experienced in its entirety, that you wouldn't teach whole class, it's perfectly acceptable if you've got a student who's ready to receive that book to self-select it.
Yeah, it's not required reading, but if you like this, keep going, go for it.
Yeah.
And I have had that happen. I've had kids look at Mouse and be like, I want to keep reading this. And usually kids get burned out on Mouse after most of the first book, so I don't make them read the second book, even though it's, I think, equally as valid. But I have those few students that want to finish and read more of that story. With that, we are actually a little bit over time. Is there any last thoughts that you guys wanted to mention or include?
Pile on just kind of what you were starting to say about this is ideal opportunities for artists and teachers. If you're a teacher at this convention, go talk to someone out there who you think would be cool. If you are a comics creator who is interested in doing a workshop, find a teacher. If you're a comics creator who doesn't know where to start doing a workshop in a comic in a classroom, email me. I've got a plan that I will share with you. It doesn't even require you to draw. There's just so many great opportunities, especially here at Staple, to find these people that you can work with. And if you're a teacher feeling it perhaps a little intimidated, that's how I got brought in American-born Chinese. She wanted to teach a graphic novel, but she knew she didn't know enough about it. But she knew the librarian knew me, and there will be people. There are resources on both sides for all this, and this is a great opportunity for you to find them. And this is also the great opportunity for you to commission someone to write the science book that you want to use to teach. Yeah.
Well, thank you guys very much for being here. And please, if you do have questions, contact any one of us. We would definitely love talking to people about books and education, and comic books and education, rather. Thank you very much.